Good evening. It is one of the most famous buildings in the world. It has stood on the banks of the River Seine for more than 800 years. Tonight, Notre Dame Cathedral in Paris is completely engulfed by fire. Notre Dame took 200 years to build. It's one of the greatest treasures of medieval architecture. Tonight, it lies in ruins.
It was April 15th, 2019. I remember sitting next to my wife in our living room, stupefied at the video of fires raging at Notre Dame.
The latest pictures that we have got showing the true extent of the blaze inside, virtually everything alight, as you can see.
I've never been to Paris. I've never been to Notre Dame. And so I wondered why I felt a wave of grief and sorrow sweep over me. What was it about this historic and cultural landmark undergoing destruction that moved me so?
A part that stood here for 800 years through war, revolution and religious unrest, engulfed within an hour by flames. Its ancient towers, beacons for both residents and tourists, crumbling into the blaze. As its current guardian watched through tears.
This is a national disaster. I'm very upset. This cathedral is 850 years old. And to see the building fall to pieces, the spire fall down, just as we were renovating it, all I can do is pray.
It's been more than 4 years since that horrible day when we watched the destruction of Notre Dame. What stands out to me is just how easy and quickly the deconstruction took place. A Gothic structure that took over 200 years to build and stood as a landmark for more than 800 was terribly ravaged by fire within just a few hours. There's a picture here of institutional fragility. The long and arduous process of building something that endures, and how fast something glorious can crumble. Building, or rebuilding, it takes a lot of time and effort. But destruction? It too can take a long time, but sometimes it can happen in moments. In the aftermath of a fire, there's always further destruction that's required. When my sister's house burned a few years ago, she and her family were able to salvage some things, but eventually, what was left of their home had to come down so that rebuilding could take place. The same has been true for Notre Dame. Additional parts of the building have been brought down, but the goal is to renew the structure, to set the stage for rebuilding and reconstruction. And that's what is happening now.
For the last few months, some of the most skilled French hands, 50 carpenters in all, have been hard at work on a project close to this country's heart. Remarkably, just like the carpenters before them, they're using methods that date back hundreds of years. Well, mostly. This 86,000 square foot warehouse in northeastern France was built just for this purpose, the crafting of Notre Dame's mighty wooden spire. And today, we're getting the first look at the first layer of the spire nearly done.
We're still a year or two away from Notre Dame reopening to the public, and the side of that spire is part of the Paris skyline once again. It's been 4 years already. It may be 6 or 7 before the reconstruction work is complete. All this work, all this labor, to restore a structure that in just a few hours went up in flames. Beauty takes time. Craftsmanship, care, persistence, perseverance. There's a Gallup poll that measures the trust people say they have in U.S. institutions from year to year. In the most recent survey, there wasn't one institution mentioned on the list. From small business to the military to organized religion, criminal justice system, Congress, television news, not one that saw an increase in the percentage of people who said they have a great deal of trust from 2021 to 2022. All continued the trend of decline. The church dropped from 37 to 31, for example. The erosion of institutional trust is one of the most seismic shifts in our culture and society today. Some of that distrust is warranted. In Season 1, we looked at the credibility crisis facing the church on several fronts. We've looked at some of the corruption in the church, rot that needs to be removed. But some of today's institutional distrust comes from overly idealistic expectations of what institutions can provide, and from the acids seeping into all areas of our culture, slowly dissolving the structures that people in the past built and blessed us with. And so the question for us, as people who love Jesus and his church, is this: how do we rebuild in the aftermath of so much institutional turmoil and destruction? I wanted to begin Season 2 of this podcast with a look at Notre Dame because it provides a picture of our current cultural moment. We're living in a time when fanning flames is more popular than building structures. There's something in the air right now that makes the idea of tearing something down more thrilling than building something up. Maybe it's because we underestimate and undervalue the difficulty of creating and cultivating something new. Maybe it's because of our natural distrust of institutions, our suspicions toward power, the deconstructive itch that finds more pleasure in critique and criticism than creation and construction. Maybe it's because we feel let down by so many people and so many institutions we admired or trusted. There are good reasons to use sledgehammers in the aftermath of a disaster. Sledgehammers have their place, but sledgehammers can't help us build anything. We'll need a hammer and nails for that, and a commitment to setting our sights on the long-term future of seeing something new arise. I'm Trevin Wax, Vice President of Research and Resource Development at the North American Mission Board. You're listening to Reconstructing Faith. In this series, we address different challenges facing the church today, offering perspective from church history and the global church, so that we meet this moment with a posture of faith, not fear, through the power of the Spirit. I hope you'll join me on this journey and consider what you can contribute to the task of restoring and rebuilding, working toward a healthier body of Christ in the days ahead. This is the first episode of Season 2. Sledgehammers don't build anything.
This is what's so difficult about stories of deconstruction and reconstruction. They're not linear. There is not this, it's not this V shape, right? It's super messy. And so even trying to describe this, the experience sometimes feels incoherent because it isn't incoherent, you know? It doesn't make a lot of sense sometimes.
This is Ian Harbour, a writer who hails from Denton, Texas. I wanted to talk with Ian because he has a story of both personal faith deconstruction and then reconstruction. For most people engaging in this conversation and with these concepts, when we talk about the desire to dismantle something or tear down or deconstruct, the conversation happens at the intersection of institutional credibility and a personal crisis of faith.
This is just such a personal process for people, you know, and I think the tendency is to try to approach this as some cold scientific method of examination, you know, and it's just not it. It's deeply personal. It's deeply emotional. And I don't say emotional pejoratively. It's not like, oh, they're blinded by their emotions. No, it's just really hard. It's really hard. It's really scary. It's easy to look at the Bible and then look at a lot of evangelical subculture and go, these things don't match up. That's legitimate, you know?
Ian was raised by his grandparents and grew up attending a conservative evangelical church and a Christian school. He adopted a legalistic version of Christianity and kept busy with all sorts of church activities, even as he wrestled with difficult intellectual questions about faith and the death of his grandmother.
It really was just trying to be as good of a person, as perfect of a person as you can. That was my understanding at the time. And it didn't take too long for me to kind of hit the bottom of that. After my grandmother passed away, there was a sequence of funerals that I went to, about 12 over 2.5 years. And some of them were family members, some of them were, you know, family, friends, and different people. But just encountering a lot of death at a pretty young age just wore down on that legalism a lot, to where I eventually just sort of got to the bottom of that, burned out, and was like, this is not something that I want to do anymore.
Around that time, Ian discovered a guy on YouTube who was giving reasons for why the fundamental pillars of Christianity are not true. The idea of God, prayer, morality, the church, a personal relationship with Jesus.
So those are the pillars that he took down. And I mean, if you think about it, you don't have those, you don't have faith. You know what I mean? Like those are pretty foundational.
Well, I wanted to drill down on the experiential aspect of your story because I think where a lot of church leaders need to recognize that it's not simply answering questions that are we ought to actually be anticipating life situations that are going to lead to some kind of, faith questioning at some level. I'm curious what you felt during the process of deconstruction. Was it a mix of emotions? Was it more relief, inspiration, freedom, or was it more of dread, grief, a lack of certainty, sort of being unmoored from this tradition that you were a part of? Like, what were you wrestling through emotionally through all of it?
D, all the above. I think it's all of it, On one hand, there's, sort of an existential relief that comes from a lot of this, right? Of finding people who are taking your questions seriously, who are engaging with it, who aren't just trying to slap a Bible verse on it or give you some easy argument. And, that kind of stuff of just like finding people who are actually getting at the heart of what you are wrestling with is extremely relieving because you don't feel crazy for once. When you're in an environment where people are threatened by questions, they have easy answers to really difficult questions that just aren't satisfying, you feel crazy. You feel like, am I the only person here that is thinking about this and seeing this? And like, surely I can't be the only one. And so once that starts unraveling, you feel your community unraveling around you. You feel your identity unraveling because your identity is wrapped up in this. Your whole sense of reality of what is true, what is not true starts unraveling. And that's terrifying.
Ian's Christian school experience didn't go well from that point on. As he tried to process his doubts and ask questions, he faced resistance and pushback, judgment for questioning. His church was somewhat different, with a student ministry that was welcoming and open to Ian, no matter what questions he brought to the table.
We had good pastors and good leaders, and one leader took me under his wing and really actually kind of helped me be a release for a lot of these questions. He was really great at handling it, super influential in my life. And then at the, kind of a few years into that mentoring relationship, he gets fired from our church because he sexually abused 5 of my close friends. So, so the safe person I had ended up being a child abuser. And that's the guy that baptized me,
Wow.
And so what do you do with that? The guy that you could actually go to talk about these things is actually not a trustworthy person at all. And I was not a victim. Several of my friends were. I was not. But if he had continued to get away with it, all the classic grooming signs were there for me as well. So it's just like, so you have an actively hostile environment, and then you have another actively hostile environment, but inside of it is actually a sort of welcoming environment, but the individual that is walking with you through that can't be trusted. It's complicated, So it was really after that happened that I was just like, I'm on my own. You know what I mean? Like, I can't trust anybody at school. I can't trust anybody at church. Like, it's just on me to figure this out now.
For about a year, Ian considered himself an atheist, but he maintained an openness to questions of faith and spirituality, which led him to consider progressive Christianity. He started listening to podcasts from those who had deconstructed their faith or turned away from traditional Christian teaching. He started speaking out about all that he thought was wrong in the church.
I would have been considered de-churched for a few years in college. I had a guy that I really respected who is, a few years older than me. He's, probably 5 or 6 years older than me. I really respected this guy. I looked up to him a ton. And he texted me one day and he says, "Hey, just want to let you know I unfollowed you on Instagram." And I was like, "Oh, thanks for telling me. Why?" And he said, "Man, you talk about the church all the time and all of its problems and all the ways it should like change and different stuff like that. You're not in a church. And so you have no vested interest. You have no skin in the game. I don't know why I should listen to you. I think you're a good guy, but I don't want to listen to your opinions on that anymore because you have no skin in the game." And I was like, I think you're right. You're right. That was kind of a fork in the road moment for me of like, do I do I really go all in on this? And I can shout from social media all I want, but if I'm not in there trying to do something, then that's right. That's right.
Ian decided he'd go back to church. So he looked for a progressive church that would fit his beliefs.
I would call them a progressive church. I would also say they were accidentally progressive because they cared about doctrine so little. They certainly did not have the thrill of orthodoxy. And, it was more pragmatic than anything, right? Let's do what works. And in their mind, not caring about theology, playing really fast and loose with a lot of doctrine and culture and different things like that just happened in their mind to be pragmatic.
Well-meaning people talk about deconstruction as if it's one phenomenon that happens to people in the same way. And so the reconstructing process will look like the same, like the mirror opposite of the deconstructing process. And really, we're talking about a really varied phenomenon. Like everybody's individual story is different. There may be some similar patterns that you detect here and there, but you can't assume that there's any sort of, step 1, 2, 3 in order to either deconstruct or reconstruct. It's just not that simple, because this is happening like as whole persons, not just intellectually or not just emotionally or not just ecclesiologically, whatever it might be.
Yeah, I cannot overstate that enough. I mean, like you said, yeah, there's patterns, there's similarities, there's things you can pick up on of, okay, these things seem to be contributing to a lot of people's stories. But there are no steps. There are no deconstruct your faith in 1, 2, 3, reconstruct your faith in 4, 5, 6. Like that is not how this works. And I just
as is evidenced by the fact that when Josh Harris wanted to do a course on deconstructing your faith, it didn't go over so well, right?
No, it didn't. I couldn't believe it when I got the Instagram ad for that. I was like, you've got to be joking me. But, and I cannot this is such a huge point. And deconstruction is something that happens to you. You don't just wake up one day and decide, I want to be closer to the Lord, so I'm going to deconstruct my faith. That is not what happens. Like you realize that the floor has dropped out from under you, and what the life you're living, the things you believe are not sustainable anymore. And now what? Now what do you do? That's deconstruction, right? And so that is what I think most people don't understand is they think, why would someone deconstruct their faith in the first place? Isn't that just playing with fire? It's like, well, they didn't choose to do that. When you're in it, you're in a dark room just looking to turn the light on, and you're just feeling around trying to find that switch somewhere. That's way more what it's like than I'm going to deconstruct, and here's why I'm going to do it. I'm going to do it in this way for this long. And there's just no process to it.
Ian's journey back to Orthodox Christianity began when he grew tired of endless questions.
Just being like, I feel like I have lived with a bunch of question marks for a really long time. And now I will never know everything. Like I will live with mystery for the rest of my life. But I am living in such an ambiguous place. I don't know if I can live my life on that. Like, I don't know how long that's going to sustain me. I would like to, I had started changing my media diet around the same time too, which is kind of an important part of this. Media, digital media, social media is such a big part of this.
He joined a church that was doing a seminary training track, and this led him into the deeper waters of Christian teaching, which began to answer some of his questions and satisfy his longings. The more he dug, the more he found the resurrection of Jesus to be the bedrock of the faith.
To the people going through it, the number one thing I want to say is, this is so normal. This is so normal. This journey has been a part of the life of Christians since the very beginning. Keep going. Take it all the way down to the foundations. If you stop at the culture wars, you haven't gone far enough. If you stop at, Calvinism or the rapture or whatever, like you haven't gone far enough. Like take it down to the bare bones of it, and really go all the way and see if this thing holds your weight. I think it will. And it might take a long time to see that. And it might take some more life experience to see that.
It was people that hurt me, it wasn't God though. I let the church trauma turn into a God wound. I learned the Western world has twisted up the scriptures. So when I re-enlisted, I learned the Eastern context, the way that Jesus meant it. My peace has been cemented, my soul has been relifted. My deconstruction ended, reconstruction is beginning. My peace has been cemented, my soul has been relifted. My deconstruction ended, reconstruction is beginning.
Way back home.
We are likely to continue seeing stories of deconstruction and reconstruction in the days ahead, especially in terms of personal faith journeys. But we're missing a big piece of our current cultural moment if we only think in terms of individuals. It affects our institutions as well. The institutional component, that's the bigger question we've got to consider. We'll be right back. Pastors need encouragement these days. That's why the North American Mission Board has compiled a number of free tools and resources to assist in ministry. Our goal is to help you engage with other pastors on the front lines, equip you for the everyday grind of ministry, and encourage you to live out your calling with confidence. You can sign up for a monthly newsletter and also receive a free ebook, a ministry toolkit for pastors. Just visit nam.net/pastors or check out the episode show notes.
This is a rigorous argument. Rigorous arguments begin by defining their terms. Quote, "When I speak of institutions, I mean the durable forms of our common life. The durable forms of our common life. They are the frameworks and structures of what we do together." Got to explain that.
This is a book conversation from Fox Nation with Peter Robinson in early 2020. It's an interview with Yuval Levin, the author of A Time to Build.
So this term institutions is very broad and capacious. It defines a lot of things, right? The family is an institution, a corporation is an institution, marriage is an institution, the rule of law is described as an institution. I think it's right to call all those things by that same name, but that means we have to think about what that name is. Our institutions are the forms of what we do together. They're not just clumps of people, they're clumps of people organized around a particular end and organized around an ideal and a way of achieving that important goal. So some of our institutions are in charge of teaching our kids, some of them enforce the law, some of them just provide us with a good or a service, but each of them forms the people within it into a shape that makes them capable of achieving that. And that's what makes them an institution.
Yuval Levin has thought a lot about institutions. He believes they're not a necessary evil, but an indispensable good for a healthy society. In fact, much of our current malaise can be traced to the weakening of institutions in an era of individualism. Our anti-institutional bent can lead us to be frustrated with institutional failure, but that frustration stems from a deeper feeling that we need institutions to be strong. And that leads me to Brad Edwards. He's a pastor at the Table Church in Colorado and host of the Post Everything podcast. He's been doing a lot of thinking lately on the ease with which we critique institutions and the challenge of actually building something.
Our tendency to deconstruct, I think, first of all, is helpful to know that it's not new. This isn't a 21st century thing. It wasn't even new in the 20th century. G.K. Chesterton's book, written in 1929, The Thing, he uses this awesome illustration and parable to describe the importance of why we shouldn't just deconstruct something automatically. And in this kind of illustration, he says, like, let's say that there is something that we don't understand the origins of or the use of. Let's say it's an institution or a law, and let's pretend that that's a fence. If you come up and say, hey, I want to tear down this fence because I don't even understand why it's here. He says, what I will tell you is that you should not tear down that fence. You need to go away and understand why that fence is there in the first place and why it was constructed. And then maybe I'll let you tear it down because you'll be informed in that.
So you're speaking my love language because you mentioned Chesterton. Did you know that Neil Gorsuch actually has used that analogy in a Supreme Court majority opinion?
Oh, that makes me so happy. No, I did not know that.
No, Chesterton gets quoted. There's several times he gets quoted in Supreme Court decisions, but Neil Gorsuch mentions the fence analogy in particular. But here's the way that the fence analogy sometimes gets misused. People will say, Chesterton was saying, you come across a fence put there by your ancestors, never tear it down. And that's not what he's saying.
Correct.
He's saying it might be that the fence needs to be torn down, but until you actually understand the reasons why it's there, you should leave it alone. You just assume the wisdom. But I think that's where we sometimes go wrong in our generation. We don't have the inclination to assume the wisdom of our ancestors, to assume that there is rationality behind some of the decisions that were made that we have to live with. We assume that we are in a superior position because of chronology, kind of where we are, because we are modern day. You mentioned social media, and you and I have talked before, and I've heard you mention social media. You call it a counterfeit institution. The way that has become a supplement to true community institution building. Explain what you mean by that, and help us to recognize, why would you call social media a counterfeit institution?
Oh man, that's a huge question. Right.
I only ask big questions, Brad. I only ask big questions. So.
That's great. What is an institution? Is basically a human greenhouse for identity. A community with both embodied narrative and formative purpose. Okay, so if that's what an institution is, then a counterfeit institution, right, is a network, not a community, because it's a digital silhouette of community. It's more of the community that's stripped down to the studs. It's just the connections, not the meat and the skin clothing it, with both disembodied narrative, which is an algorithm because it's hidden, and a deformative purpose. Chris Martin says it really well. He says social media is designed to deliver us more deeply into our own desires.
Chris Martin is the author of Terms of Service and The Wolf in Our Pockets. He does excellent work thinking about the effects of social media, and we featured his work on episode 3 of season 1.
So where a formative purpose of love God and neighbor gets us outside of ourselves, it becomes deformative by delivering us more deeply into our own desires. And so in that sense, it functions as a counterfeit institution. But what's really scary about how it's affecting society and how it's fracturing institutions is by being delivered directly into our pockets and to our smartphones specifically, it bypasses institutional gatekeepers. And so it doesn't go through the kind of almost immune system, the natural immune system of institutions that is both, yes, gatekeepers, but also just the natural mediation that happens there within a community. And so by bypassing all of that and going straight to individuals, it kind of has this, it's like an institutional autoimmune disease, and it starts causing members of a body to start attacking itself. It's crazy.
What would you say, institutions, because they are formative, because they are powerful, they do a lot of good, but they also can, because they are formative and powerful, they can do a lot of damage, right? Unhealthy institutions can hurt a lot of people. So a lot of people that are maybe more anti-institutional with a critical eye toward institutions are doing so from a place of recognizing the harm that institutions can do, maybe not giving as much attention to the good that institutions do. So what would you say to people who say, I'm so glad that a counterfeit institution like social media can get past the autoimmune, because institutions, they wind up gatekeeping and they wind up going into self-preservation mode when there's corruption that needs to be exposed, and there's all sorts of it's actually a good thing that the institution gets attacked this way, because that's what's going to lead to a purer, better institution in the future. Now, I think what you're saying is this counterfeit institution actually attacks the legitimate thing to the point that it could destroy it to where you don't get the harm, but you also don't get the benefits from it. And I think, and I agree with that. But what would you say to the people who would say, no, maybe it's like chemo and we don't want to kill the patient, but the patient needs it?
Absolutely. So I think that's why we have to understand why the fence is there, right? And I would say that there's a couple ways you can probably go about explaining why that abuse is happening, because it's not just a figment of our imaginations. Institutions have, in many ways, failed both in an active sense, like in an abusive sense, as well as in a passive sense, in terms of just not stewarding what's been entrusted to them very well, right? That's a very real thing. And I would say that you could probably go back and find in every single case a moment or a series of moments where the leadership of an institution was no longer responsible to the institution, but was protected from being responsible to it. So what I mean by that, and Yuval Levin says this in his book, A Time to Build, he talks about how viewing the lens of your leadership role through responsibility versus performance. And that is incredibly helpful, because that is what happens when we are deformed and we are turned toward and delivered more deeply into our own desires, and we're not held accountable and brought out of ourselves. Like, all of that is related. And so I would say, in a lot of ways, that in most of those senses, that happens when institutional leaders start treating and leading their institution in a way that's less institutional and more corporate. It's more about pragmatic means to a very narrow end, instead of entrusting the end to be born as fruit to faithful means.
Well, yeah, and Yuval then uses the examples of, it used to be that to be seen as a successful senator or representative, you had to get legislation passed. You had to do stuff. Nowadays, to be successful, whether you're on the right or the left, you want to get on Fox News or MSNBC and be able to spout off some talking points about how bad the other side is or how crazy they are or basically it's the performative aspect. It's not the actual legislative function of the institution anymore. You're using the institution as a platform rather than being molded and formed by the institution itself. And another thing he mentions that I wanted to bring up here is, because I think it's important for us to recognize, institutions do a lot of harm when they seek self-preservation at the expense of what their actual function was. That's really where there's been a lot of problems in the past. And I think people that take to social media or get really disillusioned with institutions are generally right about the complaint at some level when they see institutions acting unjustly. But one of the things that Yuval Levin says that's always stood out to me is he says, one of the reasons that they're so disillusioned by and upset with and frustrated by institutions is because they're right to expect a lot out of institutions. So even though we're cynical now and we're maybe overly critical at times and whatnot, some of that frustration is because we're upset that institutions aren't doing what we think they should be doing. We have high expectations for institutions because we should. So how do you manage the high expectations for institutions that we ought to have, that we ought to place, with a sense of a desire for justice, a desire for healthier, stronger institutions? How do we bring legitimate complaints to the table without the chemo killing the patient, where we're dismantling the institution without anything left?
I don't know what the full answer is, but I feel like there are a few pieces that we can absolutely point to. Number one, outside of institutions, our currency for relationship can only ever become power instead of trust. Institutions are the only vehicle in Western society that reliably cultivates trust between people who don't otherwise have a reason to. Otherwise, individually, it's going to be power. It's always going to be a competition between individuals because it's the safe harbor, it's the greenhouse that institutions serve as to bring down the volume on anxiety and threat so that you can have that conversation and you can be in that relationship apart from power. So I would say, knowing that, it at least means, number one, we have to work for the reform and the health of institutions, and that is frustratingly slow work. I don't think that we want relief, but part of what's driving the urgency of that relief is because we have so divorced ourselves from institutions that we don't have the limbic margin in our brain to be able to patiently persevere in the midst of this. Also, so that's number one, it's going to take longer than we think, in part because of what we've already done to institutions. I think also number two, we have to think systemically and not just individually. And that means that we've got to, the solution to this is going to be having processes in place that view and see everyone in the institution as equally deserving of the refuge and the resilience that institutions provide. And so that includes leaders, because if we want them to steward that responsibility well, they also have to be supported well. And I get that we don't want to reward bad behavior or incentivize that, because that's a systemic consideration too. However, leaders are human too. And there's no way they can lead something that they're not a part of. We've seen how that goes in terms of responsibility, but it's going to have equally bad and opposite effects if we do the same thing with support.
I want to zero in on the church here because you're a pastor. One of the things I've really tried to do with this, particularly season one of this podcast, has been to be, eyes wide open at the problems we've got. I mean, last season we talked a lot about removing the rot and fortifying the foundations at the same time. Like there's a lot of rot. There's some rooms that probably need to be brought down, that need to be reconstructed completely. I mean, there's going to be some areas where we've got a lot of renovation work to do. I guess at some point, you can be so focused on removing the rot for so long that you're not actually rolling up your sleeves and getting into the rebuilding process. So what does reform look like in our day and age when we're looking back at yes, clear examples of flaws, failures, crises that have been brought about by lack of stewardship or injustice or corruption or whatever, to be forthright and bold about that without basically becoming what I would call would be, instead of culture making, becoming an anti-culture, where it's basically everything is about tearing down the culture that has come before because of what has been delivered or the institution that has been delivered to us or that we've inherited. Like, how do we do reform in a way that is going to strengthen the church at the end of the day and lead to health, rather than simply dismantle and tear down the structure and where we all just sit together in the rubble?
The first step is one, kind of what we're doing right now. If you're listening to this, you are doing the absolutely necessary first step, which is growing in your awareness of institutions, how they have shaped you well, how their poor stewardship has maybe harmed you, if not at least damaged or eroded your trust therein. And also the way that social media functions as a counterfeit institution, incentivizing performative vulnerability over and above actual vulnerability that's actually messy and yes, risky. And so just growing in our awareness of that is like, it's not a small thing when we're just used to being fish swimming in water and not understanding or realizing what it means to be wet. So that's huge. Step 2, I think, is with that awareness, discerning the difference within specific institutions, the difference between weakness and rot. Okay. I think too often we see weakness and just assume that there is rot there. And every institution is weak right now. Everything we were talking about at the end of the 20th century, especially, like, institutions are weak. Like, they need to be strengthened. But weakness means that they're susceptible to rot, but it doesn't mean they're rotting. And where you find that, devote yourself to it. Throw yourself into it. Give everything you have. And that's number 3, get off social media, because you can't do that well if you are being formed and shaped primarily by a counterfeit institution. It will compromise your efforts. You will see rot where there isn't, because social media is epistemologically shaping you too, how you perceive reality. It's just doing it. By stripping it of context, it makes us think that anecdotes are actually normative. And so you just can't do both at the same time. If your job doesn't require it, you should get off social media. And number 4, settle in for the long haul and don't quit. If you keep looking for an institution that is good and healthy, it can't include you. By definition, our presence as sinners who, yes, bear the image of God and are saved by grace, the church is going to have a measure of unhealth. It is the devoting of ourselves that makes us healthy. And the more people that devote themselves to the institution and understanding that does not mean you're devoting yourself to a platform for somebody else or for yourself, the more that health becomes momentum that's hard to stop. But it takes a long time.
It's interesting you talk about devoting yourself to the church. I mean, for you to really be able to strengthen the health of the church, though, you have to be healthy yourself. And I think the irony or the paradox of this is it's mutually reinforcing, because you really can't be healthy in helping strengthen an institution if the institution isn't also involved in helping strengthen you. Like, you need the institution as much as the institution needs you. So, like, yes, there's a calling there to go strengthen an institution, but there's also a sense in which you need that yourself if you're going to be the kind of person that can strengthen an institution. You also need the formative nature of that institution. So let's say you get into a situation, though, and it's just really hard and it's a long time. Like, how do you endure? How do you not give up? Because I think it's kind of like exercising or working out. Sometimes you get to that point where you feel like you just don't have anything left to give you, is actually when you're building muscle, when you're actually getting sore, when you're actually being able to increase your endurance, right? And I feel like some people give up right at the moment when the institutional rebuilding that they're a part of is actually beginning to do good heart effects on themselves. So like, how do you encourage people to endure, to push through the pain of that? Because let's just be honest, there's pain in that.
Yes, there's a lot of pain in that. And one of the first things to go when you are trying to devote yourself to something despite the pain is you realize that your narrative on what suffering indicates and what pain means is jacked. And what I mean by that is it goes back to what we were talking about earlier about how unprecedented wealth and influence has unappreciated or depreciated our need for institutions. And because we can kind of do it without that. That means, and kind of the other side of that coin in terms of how we experience suffering and pain, and learning to suffer well is actually maybe one of the really important things that we can do. And so it's a refining thing. And something you were saying a minute ago is, I think, extremely relevant here, is this paradox of devoting ourselves to something we also need for our own health. I think that's actually the full meaning and the depth behind what Paul says when he says that God told him that his power is made perfect in weakness. It is actually when we realize how impotent our efforts are, and we are giving of ourselves, regardless of whether it produces the fruit, that the Spirit actually is going to intervene and use that to demonstrate his fruit. Because if we were devoting ourselves and rebuilding institutions on our power, is that glorifying God? I think there's a lot more opportunity there. And again, that's another way that we have not actually been gospel-centered in our ecclesiology, in our approach to the church. It's actually through our weakness that God is going to most powerfully rebuild the health that we need for the long haul.
How would you recommend we increase appreciation and gratitude for what we've inherited? Because I feel like part of the challenge we have now is because we see the flaws in 3D, right? You know, like in 4K, we can see the flaws. Ultra HD, you can see every blemish in the movie or whatever it is. It's like that with the church. Like you could, and Lord knows we have had broadcasted severe challenges and problems and rot in the church. But we go about the work of reform still with a level, even if we're looking back, maybe with some knowledge that, our forebears who handed down these institutions, they got some things right and they got some things really wrong. But how do we increase the sense of gratitude and appreciation, though, for the structures and institutions that we've inherited so that we do care about reforming them rather than just blowing things up or letting the deconstructive itch take over?
When we talk about appreciation, we're talking about a knowing that goes beyond information and requires an experience. So I don't think that there is a way to appreciation apart from devoting ourselves to the institution by actually putting some skin in the game. I mean that in every way. I just think there's no way around that. Short of that, and this is what I worry about.
But you're basically saying, like, okay, if you're reconstructing a house, until you actually are part of that process, you don't know how hard it is to build something.
Exactly.
So you start to appreciate the building more when you realize, good grief, the people that came before me that built this institution, there's a lot of blood, sweat, and tears in here that I didn't even realize were necessary because I just inherited the house. But like when you're actually with skin in the game helping to build, suddenly you start to, you have a greater appreciation for what's around you, even with its flaws.
Absolutely. I don't think there is a way, if we think we can receive or inherit a gift like institutions without devoting ourselves and giving ourselves to them, we're just going to keep doing the same thing. We're going to repeat this cycle for sure.
Acts 2:42 describes the growth of the early church. It says, they devoted themselves to the apostles' teaching, to the fellowship, to the breaking of bread, and to prayer. They devoted themselves. It wasn't a part-time effort, but a full-time engagement of the heart, a strengthening of the pillars of this countercultural community of the cross. Maybe that's the first big takeaway for us, that we would devote ourselves to the strengthening of God's people. We'll be right back. In this podcast, we've talked a lot about rebuilding and reconstructing. And one of the best organizations I can point you to in terms of compassion ministry at home and around the world is Send Relief. Send Relief offers ways to serve through mission trips and other compassion projects, as well as training to help your church start helping vulnerable people in your community. There's free video training at courses.sendrelief.org. When you give to Send Relief, 100% of your gift goes directly to projects. Nothing gets taken out for administrative costs. Go to sendrelief.org for more about how to meet needs in your neighborhood and around the world.
We are building day by day while we onward press our way, and the thoughts that fill our hearts of the building form a part. We are building day by day. Oh, direct us, Lord, we pray. If support by thy hand, surely then our house shall stand.
As any adolescent knows, playing with fire can be fun. But there's danger when we play with fire and underestimate the consequences. When fiery critiques aren't targeted only to problems that deserve to be scorched, but become missiles that destroy entire lives and institutions. Any child can burn a house down. Only an adult can build a house. And if we don't resist childish impulses, we'll end up with a landscape of destroyed houses, congratulating ourselves for demolishing all the unjust structures around us, only to discover everyone is now homeless. So what's the solution? Not idealistic naivete, closing our eyes to the injustices and problems around us without dealing with them. But neither is it another kind of idealism, thinking that we can just demolish everything that's come before us and build something new and strong in its place without a set of different problems. No, what's needed is realistic appreciation. The Southern novelist Flannery O'Connor encouraged a mindset like this in a letter from December of 1958.
It's easy for any child to pick out the faults in the sermon on his way home from church every Sunday. It's impossible for him to find out the hidden love that makes a man, in spite of his intellectual limitations, his neuroticism, his own lack of strength, give up his life to the service of God's people, however bumblingly he may go about it. It's what is invisible that God sees and that the Christian must look for, because he knows the consequences of sin. He knows how deep in you have to go to find love. We have our own responsibility for not being little ones too long, for not being scandalized. By being scandalized too long, you will scandalize others, and the guilt for that will belong to you.
Realistic appreciation. That's what keeps us from being perpetually scandalized. It helps us to look deeper than the sins we see everywhere, to the presence of love that animates God's people. We are to cultivate an understanding and appreciation for what has been bequeathed to us, even as we maintain a realism about the flaws and failures inherent in those imperfect structures. We appreciate the institution, even as we keep our eyes open to ways it can be improved. There may be areas that need the sledgehammer, but most of the time, we'll be working with hammers and nails. There may be a time and a place for deconstructing something, demolishing, removing, the sledgehammer. But we need to make sure we're aware of the gravity of our choices, of the long-lasting effects of cynicism in the culture and the church. We need scalpels alongside sledgehammers, hammers and nails. To be in the building business doesn't mean avoiding hard questions or never grappling with doubt. It doesn't mean accepting without question the assumptions we've inherited from the communities that formed us. In fact, this fortification process will often lead to harder questions. But we ask these questions with the goal of returning to the scriptures and the great Christian tradition for answers, acknowledging that we're not the first generation to wrestle, nor will we be the last. There's a difference between the questioner who delights in excoriating our Christian communities for their missteps as a way of discrediting them and disregarding their authority, and the questioner who acknowledges sin and evil by drawing us closer to the foundation of those communities, by relying on a shared commitment to the authority of God's Word as the standard by which we course correct. We need to rediscover a sense of gratitude for what has been given to us. The recognition of how difficult it is to build and preserve something lasting. One of the best practical takeaways from this episode would be to give thanks to God daily for flawed and imperfect people who fill your life, the flawed and imperfect church you attend every week, the flawed and imperfect institution you work for. Don't close your eyes to the problems. Just open your eyes to the blessing. Restoration begins with deconstruction as a roadway of repentance, filled with faith, hope, and love. Faith in the unshakable goodness of Christian truth. Hope for the day the church will better reflect the beauty of grace. And love for the stumbling people Jesus died to save. Next time on Reconstructing Faith, we take a deep dive into the de-churching of America, what it is and why it matters.
Yeah, so the online discourse about why people leave church is almost always like high-minded, like politically. I left because of Trump or gay marriage or abortion or, something very like theological or ideological or something like that. If you look at the data, most people just sort of slip away from church over time. Like it wasn't like this like big cathartic moment where it's like, I can't believe these things anymore. What you see more often is that people just, they might attend every week when they're a kid. And then when they go to college, they might attend once a month, and then they get into their late 20s, early 30s, and now it's once a year or never. So it's not like one big thing. It's just something that doesn't really make a whole lot of sense in their life, or they left it behind and don't really see a reason to pick it back up.
Reconstructing Faith is a podcast powered by the North American Mission Board. In an upcoming episode, we plan to respond to comments or questions from listeners. You can participate by giving us feedback at resources@namb.net. That's resources@namb.net. If this podcast is helpful to you, it would be helpful to us if you'd leave a 5-star review on whatever platform you're listening to and share it with your friends. Reconstructing Faith is written by Trevin Wax. Our show is produced and edited by Scott Slusher. Our sound design is composed, mixed, and mastered by Dan Phelps. Aaron Leslie handles audio editing and engineering. Story editing and consulting is by Amy Simpson. Please check out my book, The Thrill of Orthodoxy: Rediscovering the Adventure of Christian Faith. Until next time.